We express our sincere sorrow and regret for the health and welfare policies that condone the practice of forced separations. These were misguided, unwarranted, and they caused immeasurable pain. To the mothers and fathers who were denied the opportunity to love and care for your children, and for the pain and trauma you experienced, we are deeply sorry. To the sons and daughters for whom adoption meant continual anxiety, uncertainty, and the deprivation of a natural family connection, we offer our sincere apology. Today, with all members of the Parliament of Victoria gathered in this House, we acknowledge the devastating and ongoing impacts of these practices of the past. To all of those harmed, we offer our heartfelt sympathy and apologise unreservedly. We undertake to never forget what happened and to never repeat these practices. Mr. Speaker, for all those who have experienced forced adoption, the hurt is never ending. The pain is deep and overwhelming. The tears are private, lonely, and spontaneous, triggered by places, by dates, by events, or by mere passing moments, or by recollections long since weary with self-doubt. And the fear is suppressed, but it is real. And the so-called shame is implied, imposed, and very, very unfair. The blame is heartbreaking, and the resentment is a burden of unspeakable hardship. Mr. Speaker, the basis of these actions remains, even in the most benign light, wrong, disgraceful, ill-conceived, and in some cases illegal. Whatever the emotions, those who have endured the misery of forced adoptions have suffered too much and for too long. There is no substitute for that loss, but today we mark an end to the silence. We come here today to bring together those for whom separation has been a torture. And we do so as one Parliament, united in commitment to apologise to the mothers, to the fathers, to the sons and daughters, and to the families whose lives have been shackled by unhappiness and their long, quiet, unforgiving ordeal. We speak too, as best we can, for previous parliaments. And as one, we say to you all, we are sorry. If through this process we can lift even the slightest weight from your shoulders, then we will, at the very least, know better the way ahead. And that way includes extending our respect, our support and our love, and committing to ensure such wrong is never repeated. Mr. Speaker, today is an historic occasion for which many Victorians have been waiting for decades. And we all acknowledge and welcome all those who are here today in the public gallery, those watching in Queen's Hall and the Windsor Hotel across the road, and everyone across this state and across this nation, and I know across the world. Today, the Victorian Parliament is standing up and saying sorry. We know that the practice of forced adoptions occurred from early last century into the early 1980s, but it was particularly institutionalised between 1950 and 1975. During those years, at least 19,000 Victorian children were relinquished for adoption, the vast majority from young, unwed mothers. In many cases, the babies were forcibly removed by practices that were unethical, immoral and unconscionable. Young mothers were routinely compelled coerced, and given no realistic choice other than to relinquish their babies for adoption. Their birth experiences were often brutal and highly traumatic. We have all heard or read the many harrowing accounts from mothers who were subjected to the use of shackles and drugs or had blankets and pillows placed over their faces. These vulnerable young women were denied information or freedom of choice. They were bullied and victimised by the very ones in whom they were expected to place their trust, including medical and legal personnel and welfare officers. Many never saw nor held their child. They have understandably been traumatised ever since. Sadly, this state did not restrict nor condemn these practices, nor did the state provide or require support or alternatives for parents faced with a pregnancy out of wedlock. On the contrary, these practices were effectively sanctioned, and in the process, the stigma and harmful social and religious attitudes of the day were reinforced. No financial, legal, or psychological support was provided, and adoption was assumed to be the only possible option for unmarried pregnant women. Forced adoptions occurred in both state hospitals and private hospitals with the active involvement of churches and non-government agencies. Many of these bodies have already apologised for their actions, and we acknowledge the presence in Parliament House today to hear and support this apology of the senior representatives of the churches and other organisations who were involved. As a parent myself, I can barely imagine the heartache. And we can only have a small inkling of what was taken from these mothers. They never saw the beauty of their baby asleep, never heard their first words or saw their first steps. They didn't take them to their first day of school or see them walk down the aisle. These children were taken as babies and, if they were lucky, returned for some as grown-up strangers. We know too that intense shame and secrecy often surrounded these pregnancies and adoptions. These traumatised and victimised young women were told to forget about it, never to speak of it, to get on with their lives. And later, particularly at a time of reunification, many found themselves criticised again, this time accused of having given their children away. Mr. Speaker, what was done cannot now be undone. But we do hope that this official recognition and apology helps in some way to lift the burden of secrecy and bring some peace and relief. It is our undertaking today to ensure the lessons of the past are learned and are never repeated. There are very few adoptions in Victoria today, but we don't live in a perfect world, and adoption or permanent care arrangements are still sometimes the best option for some children. Now, however, we recognise that in the instances where it is appropriate, it is critical that adoption is open and transparent, with the child always understanding his or her background, and a capacity for these sons and daughters to connect with their natural family is fundamental. And we now understand that education for adoptive parents on identity issues and full care for birth mothers is also essential. Mr. Speaker, at this time I would also like to acknowledge that not all past adoptions were forced and not all of the outcomes for adopted people were poor. I would like to acknowledge the validity of informed choices and those personal positive experiences of adoption. Mr. Speaker, the Minister will shortly say more about the additional practical actions that the Government will be taking to better respond to the needs of persons affected by past adoption practices. But most importantly, today is about a Parliament apologising. Apologising for the trauma, pain and loss that so many experienced and continue to experience to this day as a result of flawed and harmful government policy. We say sorry for the moral arrogance, for the flawed justification, and for the heartless approach of authorities and institutions. We know these young mothers were terrified, ashamed and alone. And today we offer them our unreserved apology. We say very clearly, and as one, you were and are not to blame. It was not your fault. We know your love endures and is very much respected. And to the sons and daughters, we also offer our unreserved apology for the love that you too were denied. We acknowledge your lifetime of unknowns. It is our hope that in your hearts there is a place for those who, throughout their own lives, longed just as much to be there with you. Mr. Speaker, if our coming together today brings you closer together, then our community has taken an important step. I commend the motion to the House.